My name is Charles and I'm 53 years old. I've been married to Sarah for 14 years and I thought I knew her better than anyone else in this world. I was wrong. Dead wrong. What I'm about to tell you is a story of betrayal, greed, and how sometimes the people closest to us can be the ones who hurt us the most. But it's also a story about justice and how my late father's wisdom saved me from complete financial ruin. It all started 3 months ago when my father passed away. Dad was a successful businessman who owned a chain of hardware stores across Pennsylvania. He was 78 when he died, and despite his age, his death was sudden. Heart attack at his kitchen table while reading the morning paper. The funeral was beautiful, if you can call any funeral that. Sarah seemed genuinely upset, crying at the service and holding my hand tightly as we buried the man who had been like a second father to her. Dad and I had always been close. After my mother died when I was 25, it was just the two of us for a long time. When I married Sarah, he welcomed her into our small family with open arms. He'd invite us over for Sunday dinners, remember her birthday every year, and even helped us with the down payment on our house in suburban Philadelphia. Sarah always said she loved him like her own father, and I believed her completely. The reading of the will took place a week after the funeral at Dad's attorney's office downtown. James Morrison had been Dad's lawyer for over 30 years, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. The office smelled of old leather and coffee, with law books lining every wall from floor to ceiling. Sarah sat beside me, her hand resting on my knee as Morrison cleared his throat and began reading. Most of Dad's estate was straightforward. The hardware stores would be sold, and the proceeds would go into a trust fund that I would manage. The house would be mine, along with his personal belongings and a significant amount of cash from his savings accounts. But then Morrison got to the part that would change everything. "To my son Charles," he read, adjusting his glasses, "I leave the sum of $200,000 in immediate cash inheritance to be accessed within 30 days of my death. This money is intended to provide financial security and peace of mind during this difficult transition period." I felt Sarah's grip tighten on my leg. $200,000. It was more money than either of us had ever seen at once. My salary as a middle manager at a manufacturing company was decent, but not extraordinary. Sarah worked part-time at a local boutique, more for something to do than out of financial necessity. This inheritance would change our lives completely. "However," Morrison continued, and I noticed his tone becoming more serious, "there are specific conditions attached to this inheritance that must be strictly followed." Sarah shifted in her chair beside me, and I could sense her tension growing. "The inheritance must be deposited into a separate account, designated specifically for this purpose. No withdrawals or expenditures can be made from this account without both spouses providing written consent, notarized and filed with this office. Any violation of this clause will result in the immediate transfer of all remaining funds to the St. Vincent de Paul Society, as per the deceased's explicit instructions." I looked at Sarah, whose face had gone pale. She forced a smile, but I could see something flickering in her eyes that I couldn't quite identify at the time. Now I know it was calculation. Morrison handed me a thick folder containing all the paperwork, bank information, and detailed instructions for accessing the inheritance. He explained that the money was currently in a special estate account and would be transferred to the designated inheritance account within 48 hours. "Your father was very specific about these conditions, Charles," Morrison said, leaning forward slightly. "He wanted to ensure that any major financial decisions would be made jointly by you and your wife. He believed that marriage was a partnership and that significant expenditures should reflect that partnership." Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "That's so thoughtful of him," she said, her voice warm and appreciative. "He always was looking out for our best interests." As we drove home that afternoon, Sarah seemed unusually quiet. I attributed it to the emotional weight of the day, the reality of Dad's death finally sinking in. We stopped for dinner at our favorite Italian restaurant, a small family-owned place called Giuseppe's, where we'd been going for years. The owner, Giuseppe himself, came over to offer his condolences. He'd met my father several times when Dad had joined us for dinner. "Your papa. He was good man," Giuseppe said in his thick Italian accent, patting my shoulder. He always tip good, always ask about my family. You miss him, yes? I nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of grief settling over me again. Sarah reached across the table and took my hand. We'll get through this together, she said softly. Your dad would want us to be happy. That night we sat in our living room going through all the paperwork Morrison had given us. The inheritance documents were complex, filled with legal terminology that made my head spin. Sarah seemed particularly interested in the bank account information, asking several questions about access procedures and withdrawal processes. It's just so we understand everything clearly, she explained when I commented on her detailed inquiries. I want to make sure we handle your father's gift responsibly. The next morning I went to First National Bank to set up the inheritance account. The process took about 2 hours, involving multiple forms, identification verification, and the establishment of the dual signature requirement that Dad's will had specified. The bank manager, a professional woman named Patricia Williams, explained the account structure carefully. With this type of account, she said, any transaction over $50 requires both account holders to be present with proper identification or to have submitted notarized written authorization. It's an unusual setup, but your father's attorney was very specific about the requirements. I drove home feeling a mixture of sadness and gratitude, sad that Dad was gone, but grateful for his foresight and generosity. This money would allow Sarah and me to pay off our mortgage early, maybe take the European vacation we'd been talking about for years, or even consider starting the small business I'd always dreamed of. Sarah was waiting for me when I got home, practically bouncing with excitement. How did it go? She asked before I'd even gotten my coat off. All set up, I replied, showing her the account information and the special checkbook the bank had provided. We can access it any time we want, as long as we both agree on how to spend it. She hugged me tightly, and I could feel her smiling against my shoulder. Your father really did think of everything, didn't he? Over the next few weeks, we talked frequently about what to do with the money. Sarah had dozens of ideas. She wanted to renovate our kitchen, which admittedly needed updating. She suggested we could finally replace our 15-year-old car, or maybe even buy a small vacation cabin in the Pocono Mountains. I was more conservative, thinking we should invest most of it, and maybe spend a small portion on some immediate improvements to our quality of life. We don't have to decide right away, I kept saying. Let's take our time and make sure we're making the right choices. Sarah agreed, but I noticed she kept bringing up different spending ideas almost daily. She'd show me pictures of kitchen renovations on her phone, or point out cars she liked when we were driving around town. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself getting excited about the possibilities too. About a month after we'd set up the account, Sarah's behavior started to change subtly. She seemed more secretive about her phone calls, often stepping outside or going to another room when someone called. She started spending more time out of the house, claiming she was shopping with her sister Lisa or helping her mother with various projects. Sarah had always been social, so I didn't think much of it at first. Her sister Lisa lived about 20 minutes away, and they'd always been close. Her mother, Dorothy, was 71 and had been having some health issues, so it made sense that Sarah would want to spend more time helping out. But then I started noticing other things. Sarah began receiving packages at the house that she'd quickly take to our bedroom before I could see what they were. When I asked about them, she'd give vague answers about just some things I ordered online or stuff for my mother. She also started talking about money differently. Instead of discussing our joint financial decisions, she'd make comments about what she wanted to buy, as if the money was already allocated for her personal use. I saw the most beautiful dining room set at Henderson's Furniture, she said one evening while we were watching television. It would look perfect in our dining room. How much? I asked. Only $3,000, she replied casually. Only $3,000. As if $3,000 was pocket change. Don't you think we should talk about big purchases like that? I said carefully. Sarah shrugged. It's not that big. We have plenty of money now. Something about her tone bothered me, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was. It was as if she'd already made the decision and was just informing me about it. The first real warning sign came 6 weeks after Dad's funeral. I was cleaning out my wallet and noticed that one of my credit cards was missing. It was a card I rarely used, mainly keeping it for emergencies. I mentioned it to Sarah, thinking maybe I'd dropped it somewhere. "Oh, I borrowed it last week," she said without looking up from her magazine. "I needed to pick up some things and left my purse at home." "What things?" I asked. "Just stuff," she replied vaguely. "I'll give it back to you later." But she didn't give it back that night or the next day. When I finally asked about it again, she seemed annoyed. "I'm your wife, Charles. Do I really need permission to use a credit card?" The question caught me off guard. We'd always discussed major purchases, but she was right that we'd never had strict rules about credit card usage. Still, something felt off about the whole situation. I decided to check our credit card statements online that weekend. What I found made my blood run cold. Over the past month, Sarah had charged nearly $8,000 to various cards. The purchases ranged from expensive clothing and jewelry to furniture and electronics. Many of the transactions were at stores I'd never heard of, in parts of town we rarely visited. $8,000. In 1 month. I printed out all the statements and spread them across our kitchen table, my hands shaking as I added up the totals. Some of the individual purchases were shocking. A $1,500 handbag, a $1,000 coat, $700 at a high-end cosmetics store. When Sarah came home from what she'd said was a grocery shopping trip, I was waiting for her with the credit card statements. "What is this?" I asked, gesturing to the papers covering the table. Sarah's face immediately flushed red, but she tried to maintain her composure. "Those are just some things I needed," she said defensively. $8,000 worth of things you needed." My voice was rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "Sarah, what the hell is going on?" She sat down across from me, and for a moment I thought she was going to break down and explain everything. Instead, she went on the offensive. "Your father left us that money to improve our lives," she said, her voice getting sharper. "What's the point of having it if we're going to live like paupers?" "We agreed to discuss major purchases together," I replied. "This isn't improving our lives together. This is you going on a shopping spree without telling me." "I'm telling you now," she snapped. The argument that followed was one of the worst we'd ever had. Sarah accused me of being controlling and cheap. I accused her of being dishonest and reckless. We went to bed that night without speaking to each other, and the tension in our house was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The next morning, Sarah seemed genuinely remorseful. She made my favorite breakfast and apologized for not discussing the purchases with me beforehand. "You're right," she said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "I should have talked to you first. I guess I just got excited about finally being able to afford nice things." I wanted to believe her. I loved my wife, and I wanted to trust that this was just a temporary lapse in judgment, brought on by the sudden windfall of money. "Let's agree that from now on, we'll discuss any purchase over $500 before we make it," I said. Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely, I promise." But the promise didn't last long. 2 weeks later, I discovered that Sarah had somehow accessed our inheritance account. I found out by accident. I'd gone to the bank to make a routine deposit into our regular checking account when Patricia Williams, the bank manager who'd helped set up the inheritance account, approached me. "Mr. Henderson," she said, looking somewhat concerned, "I wanted to follow up with you about the large withdrawal from your inheritance account last week." My stomach dropped. "What withdrawal?" Patricia's expression immediately shifted from concern to alarm. "The $20,000 withdrawal. Your wife came in with what appeared to be proper documentation. $20,000. Sarah had somehow withdrawn $20,000 from our inheritance account without my knowledge or consent." "What documentation?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Patricia led me to her office and pulled out a file. Inside was a notarized letter, supposedly signed by me, authorizing the withdrawal. The signature looked like mine, but I knew I'd never signed such a document. "When did this happen?" I asked. "Last Tuesday afternoon," Patricia replied. "Your wife presented this authorization letter along with proper identification. Everything appeared to be in order." "Last Tuesday?" I'd been at work all day, in meetings until after 6 o'clock. There was no way I could have been at a notary's office. "This signature is forged," I said, staring at the document. Patricia's face went pale. "Mr. Henderson, if that's the case, we need to involve law enforcement immediately. This would constitute bank fraud. I asked for copies of all the documentation and told Patricia I needed some time to process what had happened before deciding how to proceed. She assured me that the account would be immediately frozen to prevent any further unauthorized transactions. I sat in my car in the bank parking lot for 20 minutes, staring at the forged authorization letter. My wife, the woman I'd loved and trusted for 14 years, had stolen $20,000 from me. She'd forged my signature and lied to bank officials to access money that wasn't rightfully hers. But more than the money, it was the betrayal that cut deepest. How long had she been planning this? How had she managed to forge my signature so convincingly? What else had she lied about? I drove home in a daze, my mind racing with questions and scenarios. Part of me hoped there was some reasonable explanation, that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew the truth. Sarah had betrayed me in the worst possible way. She was in the kitchen when I walked in, humming softly while preparing what looked like an elaborate dinner. Candles were lit on the dining room table, and I could smell her perfume from across the room. "Hi, honey," she said brightly, turning to give me a kiss. "I thought we could have a nice romantic dinner tonight." I stared at her, amazed by her ability to act normal while carrying such a massive secret. "We need to talk," I said quietly. Something in my tone must have warned her, because her smile faltered slightly. "What about?" I pulled out the bank documents and placed them on the kitchen counter. "About the $20,000 you stole from our inheritance account." The color drained from Sarah's face completely. For a moment she looked like she might faint. Then, just as quickly, her expression hardened. "I didn't steal anything," she said defiantly. "That money belongs to both of us." "The money belongs to both of us, but you accessed it by forging my signature and lying to the bank," I replied, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. "That's called fraud, Sarah." She turned away from me, gripping the edge of the counter with both hands. "I needed that money," she said finally. "For what? For more designer handbags and expensive jewelry?" Sarah spun around, her eyes blazing with anger. "You don't understand anything, Charles. You think you're so smart with your careful planning and your conservative investments, but you have no idea what it's like to live paycheck to paycheck while watching everyone else have nice things." "We don't live paycheck to paycheck," I shouted. "We have a comfortable life, a nice house, everything we need." "Everything you think we need," she corrected. "But what about what I need? What about what I want?" The argument that followed was brutal. Sarah revealed a side of herself I'd never seen before. She was bitter about our financial situation, resentful that we couldn't afford the lifestyle she wanted, and angry that I was hoarding the inheritance money instead of spending it freely. "Your father left that money for us to enjoy," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "But you want to sit on it like some old miser, counting every penny while life passes us by." "My father left specific instructions about how that money should be managed," I replied. "Instructions that you completely ignored when you decided to commit fraud." Sarah laughed bitterly. "Instructions from a dead man about money that's supposed to make our lives better. Well, I decided to make my life better." "What did you spend it on, Sarah?" "All of it. I want to know exactly where every penny went." She was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was much softer. "I invested it," she said. "Invested it in what?" "In Derek's business." Derek, Sarah's sister Lisa's husband. A man I'd never particularly liked, who always seemed to have grand schemes for making money that never quite worked out. "What business?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I didn't want to know the answer. "He's starting a restaurant, a high-end place downtown. He needed investors, and he promised to double our money within 6 months." I stared at my wife in complete disbelief. She'd stolen $20,000 from our inheritance and given it to Derek, a man whose previous business ventures had included a failed landscaping company, a short-lived auto detailing service, and a disastrous attempt at selling insurance. "Sarah, Derek is a con artist, you know that. Everyone knows that." "He's not a con artist," she said defensively. "This restaurant idea is solid. He's done all the research, found the perfect location, everything." "Where's the restaurant going to be?" Sarah hesitated. "He's still finalizing the location." "Where's the business plan? Where are the contracts? Where's any documentation showing that this is a legitimate investment? The longer Sarah was quiet, the more obvious it became that she had no answers to these questions. He's family, Charles. I trust him. More than you trust me, apparently. That seemed to hit her hard. She sank into one of our kitchen chairs, suddenly looking much older than her 46 years. I thought I could replace the money before you found out, she admitted quietly. Derek promised he'd have my initial investment back to me within 30 days, plus a substantial return. When was that promise made? 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. The money should have been returned already if Derek's promises had been genuine. Have you heard from Derek lately? I asked. Sarah's silence was answer enough. I spent the rest of that evening trying to contact Derek. His phone went straight to voicemail. His Facebook page hadn't been updated in over a week. When I called Sarah's sister Lisa, she seemed surprised to hear from me. Derek's been out of town on business, she said when I asked to speak with him. Some big meetings about his restaurant project. What restaurant project? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The one he's been working on with Sarah, Lisa said slowly. She told me you were both investors. Lisa, I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you know anything about this restaurant business Derek supposedly started? Another pause, longer this time. Charles, Derek hasn't mentioned any restaurant to me. He's been talking about maybe getting back into landscaping when the weather gets warmer. My heart sank. Derek had taken Sarah's money with no intention of starting any business. He'd simply seen an opportunity to get $20,000 from a gullible woman and had taken it. When I confronted Sarah with this information, she broke down completely. Through her tears, she admitted that she hadn't heard from Derek in over a week, that his phone was disconnected, and that she was starting to suspect she'd been conned. I'm so sorry, Charles, she sobbed. I thought I was making a smart investment for our future. You thought you were making a smart investment by stealing money and lying to your husband. I wasn't thinking clearly, she said. I just wanted us to have more than we had. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while Sarah cried herself to sleep beside me. I felt like I was married to a stranger. The woman I'd shared my life with for 14 years had revealed herself to be someone I didn't know at all, someone capable of theft, fraud, and betrayal. But the story doesn't end there, because my father, even in death, had one more surprise in store. The next morning, I called James Morrison, Dad's attorney, to inform him about what had happened. I expected him to be shocked and sympathetic. Instead, he was surprisingly calm. I was wondering when this call would come, he said. What do you mean? Charles, your father anticipated that something like this might happen. Morrison asked me to come to his office immediately and to bring all the documentation related to the unauthorized withdrawal. When I arrived an hour later, he was waiting with another thick folder. Your father was a very perceptive man, Morrison began, settling into his chair across from his desk. He'd observed your wife's spending habits over the years, her attitudes about money, her, let's call them, materialistic tendencies. I was stunned. I'd never noticed Dad making any judgments about Sarah's character. He never said anything to me about concerns regarding Sarah. Of course not. He loved you, and he knew you loved her. But he also wanted to protect you from exactly what has happened. Morrison opened the folder and pulled out several documents. The inheritance I read to you that day was only part of your father's bequest. There was a secondary provision that was to be activated only if the primary inheritance was accessed improperly. He handed me a document I'd never seen before. It was another will, or rather, an addendum to the original will. If any portion of the initial inheritance was withdrawn without proper dual authorization, as verified by the bank's records, then a secondary trust fund would be activated. This fund contains an additional $300,000, Charles. It's yours alone, with no requirement for spousal consent or notification. $300,000. I stared at the document, unable to process what I was reading. Your father set up this secondary trust through a different bank, with different attorneys, specifically to ensure that if something went wrong with the primary inheritance, you would still be financially secure. Morrison explained that the trust had been established years ago, before Dad even became seriously ill. It was funded through a complex arrangement involving life insurance policies and investment accounts that had been growing steadily over time. The beauty of this arrangement, Morrison continued, is that the secondary trust was never mentioned in the primary will reading, so your wife has no knowledge of its existence. Your father's instructions were very clear. This money is for you alone, to be accessed only after any improper use of the primary inheritance has been documented and verified. I felt like I was dreaming. My father had somehow anticipated Sarah's betrayal and had protected me from it, even from beyond the grave. "There's more," Morrison said, pulling out another set of documents. "Your father also established a private investigation fund. If you choose to pursue criminal charges against your wife or to try to recover the stolen money from Derek, this fund will cover all legal expenses, private investigator fees, and court costs." The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. The private investigator Morrison recommended, a former FBI agent named Robert Chen, located Derek within 48 hours. He'd used the $20,000 to pay off gambling debts and had never had any intention of starting a restaurant. Derek was arrested and charged with fraud. Sarah was also charged as an accessory after the fact, though her attorney managed to get her charges reduced in exchange for her cooperation in the case against Derek. The legal proceedings took several months, during which Sarah and I barely spoke to each other. She moved in with her sister Lisa, and I filed for divorce. The betrayal was too deep, the trust too shattered to ever repair. During the divorce proceedings, Sarah's attorney tried to claim that she was entitled to half of the secondary trust fund, arguing that all assets acquired during marriage were community property. But my father's attorneys had anticipated this as well. The secondary trust had been structured in such a way that it was legally separate from any marital assets, belonging solely to me as a beneficiary of my father's estate. In the end, Derek was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution, though he had no assets left to seize. Sarah received probation and community service, as well as a permanent criminal record for bank fraud. I kept the house, since I'd been making the mortgage payments from my salary long before the inheritance. Sarah was entitled to half of our other marital assets, but after legal fees and the money she owed in restitution, her portion was minimal. The divorce was finalized 8 months after Dad's funeral. Sarah moved to another state to live with her mother and start over. We haven't spoken since the day she signed the final papers. I'm telling you this story not for sympathy, but as a warning. You think you know the people closest to you, but money has a way of revealing people's true character. My father understood this, and his wisdom saved me from complete financial and emotional ruin. The $300,000 from the secondary trust fund is sitting safely in a new bank account that only I have access to. I've used a small portion of it to make some improvements to the house and to take the European vacation I'd always wanted to take with Sarah. I took it alone instead, and it was one of the most liberating experiences of my life. I'm 53 years old, financially secure, and finally free from a marriage that I now realize had been built on false foundations for years. Sarah's betrayal was devastating, but it also opened my eyes to reality and gave me a chance to build a new life based on honesty and authenticity. My father's final gift wasn't just the money he left me. It was the lesson that protecting yourself from those who would take advantage of your trust isn't cynicism, it's wisdom. And sometimes, the people who claim to love you the most are the ones you need to be most careful around. I've started dating again, slowly and carefully. I've learned to pay attention to how potential partners talk about money, how they handle their own finances, and whether their actions match their words. I'll never again make the mistake of assuming that love and trust are the same thing. The house feels different now, lighter somehow. I've redecorated the rooms that held too many memories of Sarah, and I've created new spaces that reflect who I am rather than who we were as a couple. Sometimes I wonder if things could have been different. If I'd been more attentive to the warning signs, if I'd been firmer about financial boundaries, if I'd somehow seen Sarah's true character before it was too late. But those thoughts don't consume me anymore. Instead, I focus on the future and on the fact that my father's love and wisdom protected me when I needed it most. The trust fund clause in Dad's will wasn't just about money. It was about understanding human nature and preparing for the possibility that even those we love most might disappoint us. My father saw something in Sarah that I was blind to, and he made sure I would be okay when the truth finally came to light. I visit Dad's grave every few weeks, usually on Sundays after church. I tell him about my life, about the divorce, about how his plan worked exactly as he'd hoped it would. I thank him for his foresight and for loving me enough to protect me from my own naivety. The headstone is simple black granite with his name, dates, and a phrase he'd chosen himself. A man's worth is measured not by what he accumulates, but by what he protects for those he loves. I understand now what he meant by that. Dad didn't just leave me money. He left me protection, wisdom, and the tools I needed to rebuild my life after betrayal. That's worth more than any inheritance could ever be. As I'm recording this story, it's been almost a year since Dad died, and 9 months since my divorce was finalized. I've heard through mutual friends that Sarah is working at a retail store in Ohio and living in a small apartment with her mother. Derek got out of prison after serving 18 months and is apparently working construction, and still owes me nearly $15,000 in restitution that I'll probably never see. But I'm not bitter about the money anymore. In a strange way, losing that initial $20,000 was the best thing that could have happened to me. It revealed the truth about my marriage and freed me from a relationship that was built on deception and selfishness. I've learned that real wealth isn't about how much money you have in the bank. It's about being surrounded by people who love and respect you for who you are, not what you can give them. It's about having integrity and being able to sleep peacefully at night, knowing that you've treated others with honesty and fairness. My father's trust fund clause didn't just protect my financial future, it protected my entire future. Without it, I might have spent years trying to rebuild our marriage, never knowing that Sarah was capable of such betrayal. I might have continued living a lie, never understanding that the woman I thought I knew was actually someone completely different. Now I have a chance to build a life based on truth and authenticity. I have a chance to find love with someone who shares my values and respects the importance of trust in a relationship. I have a chance to honor my father's memory by living with the wisdom he tried to pass on to me. The house is quiet now as I finish telling this story, but it's a peaceful quiet rather than a lonely one. Tomorrow I'm having lunch with a woman I met at church, someone who makes me laugh and who talks about money and life in ways that tell me she understands what really matters. I don't know where this new relationship will lead, but I know it's starting from a place of honesty and mutual respect. I know that I'm a wiser man than I was a year ago, and that my father's love continues to guide and protect me, even though he's gone. If you're listening to this story, and you're married or in a serious relationship, pay attention to how your partner handles money and trust. Don't ignore red flags or make excuses for behavior that doesn't feel right. Love doesn't justify theft, and trust, once broken, is almost impossible to repair completely. And if you're planning your own estate, consider the wisdom of my father's approach. Sometimes protecting the people you love means preparing for the possibility that others might try to take advantage of them. A well-structured will and trust can provide not just financial security, but also protection from those who would exploit grief and vulnerability for their own gain. My father spent his last years making sure I would be okay after he was gone. He couldn't prevent Sarah from betraying me, but he could ensure that her betrayal wouldn't destroy me financially or emotionally. That's love in its purest form, protecting someone even when you're no longer there to do it in person. The trust fund clause saved me from ruin, but more importantly, it saved me from a life of deception. I'm grateful for both the money and the lesson, and I carry my father's wisdom with me every day as I build this new chapter of my life. Charles Henderson, recording this on a quiet Sunday evening in Philadelphia, 1 year after my world fell apart and began to rebuild itself into something better.